You do projections for games using your own formula, something you call RPI, Relative Performance Index. Now, for our listeners who don't remember when you've been on the show previously, could you give us just a real quick primer on how that works?
RPI takes a team's performance against its opponent. So, for example, if Penn State played Michigan, which we did, right, and the Penn State defense allowed 41 points against Michigan, the Michigan offense typically scores 40. So that gives an RPI of like 102%. Similarly, if you look at, a team scoring points, maybe, if Penn State scored 40 points and Michigan was only allowing 20, then that would be a 200% performance for the Penn State offense. And we do that for every opponent in a number of stats that we can track easily. For offensive numbers, a higher RPI is better, right? Meaning that our team got more than what the opponents typically would allow. And then for defense, a lower RPI is better, meaning that the team gave up fewer than or less than what would be expected against some opponent.
So if you play a team with a really good defense, and it may not appear that you scored a lot of points, but relative to what that team allows, you did well. So let's look at some specifics with Penn State and Utah. Let's start with yardage, both offensively and defensively.
What we're going to find in both of these situations is that on an RPI basis, both Penn State and Utah are quite good. Penn State, from an offensive generation, rushing has an RPI of 120%, so they do about 20% better on average than what you would expect them to get. That comes in a little bit of a bimodal distribution for rushing, though, where they have a number of games above 130%, and then some games 90 or below. So they have a very wide spread in their average. Utah rushing has a 116, so slightly worse than Penn State, but they have a higher floor than Penn State does, where their worst offensive rushing performance is about 85. But they also have a lower ceiling, with their best being about 140. So Penn State's best was over 170%. So, they're very similar on average. Maybe Utah rushing is a little more consistent. When it comes to passing, very similar thing. Penn State 109, Utah 104. Similar. Utah has a low floor here, though. Their bottom was 60%, whereas Penn State's bottom was 80%, give or take. And then in total yards per play overall, Penn State has a 112% RPI, and Utah has a 106. The defenses that Penn State played on average give up fewer yards per play than the teams that Utah played.
Now, one of my favorite numbers that you have used is something called havoc plays. And you got the numbers for that for both Penn State and Utah.
Yeah, so normally havoc, and this comes from Bill Connolly, so it's sacks, tackles for loss, pass breakups, and then turnovers as a function of total plays. So if a defense goes against an offense 100 plays and they have, say, 10 sacks and tackles for loss combined, and then 5 pass breakups and 3 turnovers, that would be 18 total plays. So they would have a havoc rate of 18%. Penn State's defense has been very good, and especially as the season went on, has gotten increasingly better at generating havoc in the form of sacks and tackles for loss. So they have a very high relative performance against the entirety of their schedule, with a 142% in sacks and tackles for loss. Utah also very good, generating 128% against the Pac-12 opponents. So, if Caden Wallace and Olu Fashanu come back for the bowl game, it's going to be very, very important for the success of of the Penn State offense and not allowing a lot of havoc in the backfield.
All right, let's get to the numbers for points scored and points allowed, and tell us how that leads to your prediction for the Rose Bowl.
The yards per play is really telling about how RPI works, because Penn State averages only 6.1 yards per play versus Utah's 6.5 in the Pac-12. But when you go through the same machination and calculation, I end up expecting Penn State to have 6 yards per play versus Utah's 5.1. And that, highlights the strength of the Penn State defense, maybe a little bit of a weakness in the Utah opponents' defenses. But overall, I think they're very similar, offensive teams, but Penn State's defense is going to win the game for Penn State. And that manifests itself both in the yards per play and the scoring.